India is facing a persistent cash squeeze that is pushing up its short-term borrowing costs and threatening its economic recovery. In this section, we will explain how India's cash squeeze, caused by a spike in the overnight rate and an asymmetrical distribution of funds between banks, is affecting its economic recovery and credit allocation. The overnight rate, also known as the weighted average call rate, is the interest rate that banks charge each other for lending and borrowing money overnight. This rate is closely monitored by the Reserve Bank of India, RBI, the central bank, which sets a policy rate corridor to keep it within a certain range. The policy rate corridor consists of a lower bound, called the reverse repo rate, and an upper bound, called the repo rate. The reverse repo rate is the interest rate that the RBI pays to banks for depositing their excess cash with it, while the repo rate is the interest rate that the RBI charges to banks for borrowing money from it. The RBI uses various tools to manage the liquidity in the banking system, such as open market operations, term repos, and cash reserve ratio. Liquidity refers to the availability of cash in the system, which affects the demand and supply of money and hence the overnight rate. When there is excess liquidity in the system, the overnight rate tends to fall below the reverse repo rate, and when there is a liquidity deficit in the system, the overnight rate tends to rise above the repo rate. Since 2022, the RBI has been tightening its monetary policy to fight inflation, which means it has been raising its policy rates and draining liquidity from the system. As a result, the overnight rate has been increasing steadily and has breached the upper bound of the policy rate corridor several times this year. According to Bloomberg, on May 17, 2023, the overnight rate was 6.78%, which was higher than the repo rate of 6.75%. This indicates that there is a severe cash crunch in India, which makes it more expensive for banks to borrow money overnight. The cash squeeze in India has been exacerbated by two other factors: a buildup of government cash surplus and an uneven distribution of funds among banks. The government cash surplus refers to the excess of government revenues over expenditures, which reduces the amount of money circulating in the economy. According to Money Control, as of May 11, 2023, the government had a cash surplus of 4.5 trillion rupees, $54.7 billion, which was parked with the RBI. This means that less money was available for lending and borrowing in the market. The uneven distribution of funds among banks refers to the situation where some banks have more cash than they need, while others have less cash than they need. This creates a mismatch between supply and demand of money in different segments of the market and leads to volatility in the overnight rate. According to State Bank of India, this asymmetry is caused by factors such as regulatory requirements, credit ratings, deposit growth, and loan demand. The persistent cash squeeze in India has negative implications for its economic recovery and credit allocation. Economic recovery refers to the process of restoring economic growth after a downturn or a shock. Credit allocation refers to the process of distributing funds among different sectors and borrowers according to their needs and risks. The cash squeeze affects economic recovery by raising financing costs for businesses and consumers, especially those with weaker credit profiles. Higher financing costs reduce investment and consumption spending, which are key drivers of economic growth. According to India Ratings and Research, high rates reflect tightening liquidity and clouded financing conditions for firms with weaker credit profile. The cash squeeze also affects credit allocation by distorting market signals and creating inefficiencies. When there is a liquidity deficit in the system, banks tend to lend more to safer borrowers who can offer collateral or higher interest rates, while ignoring riskier borrowers who may have more productive or innovative projects. This leads to misallocation of credit and lower economic efficiency. To sum up, India's cash squeeze, caused by a spike in the overnight rate and an asymmetrical distribution of funds between banks, is affecting its economic recovery and credit allocation by raising financing costs and creating inefficiencies. The RBI may offer temporary liquidity relief to ease the situation, but it may not be enough to address the underlying structural issues that are causing the cash crunch. India is one of the world's largest consumers and producers of fossil fuels, especially coal, which accounts for over 70% of its electricity generation. Coal is also a major source of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in India, contributing to health problems, environmental degradation, and climate change. Despite these costs, coal enjoys significant subsidies from the government, which aims to ensure energy security and economic growth for its 1.4 billion people. According to a recent report by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, ISD, and the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, CW, India's subsidies for fossil fuels, such as coal, oil and gas, have dropped by 72% to 68,226 Indian rupees crore, $8.528 billion between FYs 2014 to 21. However, subsidies in FY 2021 are still 9 times higher than renewable energy subsidies. The report also found that fossil fuel subsidies were mainly driven by support for consumers of gasoline and diesel, which mainly benefit the middle class, and for producers, transporters and processors of coal as well as utilities that burn coal. In contrast, India's subsidies for renewable energy, such as solar, wind and biofuels, have increased by 35% to 7,497 Indian rupees crore, $937 million between FYs 2014 to 21. However, subsidies for renewables dropped by 35% while subsidies for oil and gas went up by 65% since FY 2017. The report also found that renewable energy subsidies were mainly driven by support for grid-connected solar power projects and off-grid solar applications. The disparity between fossil fuel and renewable energy subsidies reflects India's priority of energy security and economic growth over climate goals. India has pledged to reduce its emissions intensity by 33 to 35% by 2030 from 2005 levels and to achieve 40% of its electricity capacity from non-fossil sources by 2030 under the Paris Agreement. However, it has not committed to a net zero emissions target or a coal phase-out date unlike many other countries. India argues that it has a right to use fossil fuels to meet its development needs and that it has a low per capita emissions compared to developed countries. India's energy policy is thus a balancing act between competing objectives and interests. On one hand, India is pursuing clean energy transition by investing in renewable energy, electric vehicles and energy efficiency. On the other hand, India is expanding its fossil fuel capacity by building new coal-fired power plants, increasing domestic coal production and importing more oil and gas. While India has made some progress in reforming perverse subsidies and backing clean energy, it still needs to shift more public resources away from fossil fuels and toward clean energy to align its health and economic coping strategies with its desired energy future.